I just started remembering what it was like being 9 years old. The same age my son, Wyatt, is now. He's my only kid, and he's a gentle and curious boy. Which is why I worry this whole thing is about to go horribly wrong. I was tough, but I think my parents' divorce was what set it off for me. I didn't see it coming, and wasn't prepared for being alone in our big house with just my mom. But Dad had to leave, so it was just us. Everything felt different after he left. Especially my room. It always felt like there were sets of eyes following me from under the bed to the closet. And then back again. I'd walk past the closet and see movement in my peripherals, but I'd never turn fast enough to catch it. The incidents in the closet grew over time. It'd be every 3 or 4 nights. Sometimes 6. Sometimes 10. Just long enough for me to hope the thing wasn't coming back. But then I'd be laying in bed, and a coat hanger would twist and squeak. Or a toy block would tumble, or pages in a book would flip. One night my closet door slowly creaked open. I pulled the covers down and finally saw what it was. My scream shook the town, and my mom was in my room in under 5 seconds flat. She'd been awake and trying to drink herself to sleep down the hall. My mom checked the closet but found nothing. I convinced her to let me sleep in her bed that night, but she was adamant it wouldn't become a habit. I knew I couldn't stay in my room anymore. And didn't really want to stay in the house. But I didn't like the idea of that thing in my room. Or near my mom. So the next night, I made a plan and spent the whole day preparing. It was shortly after midnight when my closet door creaked open. A tall, impossibly long-limbed figure ducked out from under the frame of the closet and into my room. It moved awkwardly, like a man unable to fully control his limbs. His body and head were tiny, reminding me of daddy long-legged spiders. The man had to curl under the ceiling as he approached my bed. He leaned over the tiny mound under the blankets and peeled them back to reveal clothes strategically placed to resemble my body. And in the center, a knife pointed upwards, taped to a mechanical toy trebuchet. Its trigger pin had a long string attached to it, which ran off the bed and behind the dresser, along the wall, and to a mound of clothes in the corner, which I was hidden in. I'd tricked it. I pulled the string and the pin yanked out. The trebuchet snapped forward and the knife swung up, slamming into the tall man's face. He stumbled backwards, falling into the closet and pulling the door shut behind him. I climbed out of my hunting blind with a hockey stick I'd taped a flashlight to and another one of my mom's knives to the end of. I opened the closet, ready to jab forward, but it was empty. I turned on the ceiling lights and found a trail of strange dark blood from my bed to the middle of the closet. The blood disappeared in the middle of the floor. I cleaned the blood up with bleach and left the light on for the rest of the night. Then I moved to the second part of my plan. Our family were big campers, and I'd watched my dad set up the tent plenty of times. I loved sleeping outside under the stars and convinced my mom to let me sleep in the backyard in the tent for the week. The week turned into a month. And that turned into 3 months. I spent the entire summer in the tent. When my mom made me finally come in and sleep in my room again, my closet was normal. The tall man never came back. I eventually stopped thinking about him and grew up. I didn't think of the man again until my wife and I went to a parent-teacher meeting. Wyatt was kept separate from it. The teacher, Mrs. Boyle, thought Wyatt was a great kid. Very intelligent and kind. With an expansive imagination. His creativity had typically produced very diverse work. But the past few weeks, things had changed. He'd only been drawing one thing. It was a stick figure of a frightening, distorted-looking man. Who was very tall. The man's arms and legs were long. Too long for the tiny head and body, which were made up of small swirls and spikes. Wyatt had written Mr. Daddy Long Legs on all of the drawings. My heart skipped a beat and I felt like I was 9 again. Apparently, Wyatt was speaking with Mr. Daddy Long Legs constantly in class. I didn't remember anything else that was said in the meeting. It was like I went deaf. My wife and I picked Wyatt up from the adjacent classroom after. It was a quiet walk to the car, and an even quieter drive. From the back seat, Wyatt finally broke the silence. He asked if Mrs. Boyle brought up the drawings. I said she did bring them up. Then asked Wyatt who the man in the drawings was. Wyatt told me, "You know who he is. You met him before." I lied and responded, "I don't remember meeting him." Wyatt leaned forward in his seat, up to my shoulder, and whispered, "He remembers meeting you." The Diner is a scary story about 3 boys who go on a road trip. They stop for a bite to eat at an old restaurant in a remote area and end up offending a creepy old woman. Last summer, I went on a trip with my best friends, Pasha and Cyril. We rented a cabin in the woods and planned to stay there for a week, enjoying the countryside. I am a keen amateur photographer, and I was looking forward to the chance to take some photos of whatever plants and wildlife we found out there in the wilderness. We started out early in the morning on the day of our trip. After packing our supplies into the boot of the car, we set out on the road. It was going to be a long journey, and while I was driving, Pasha and Cyril decided to take a nap in the back seat. 3 hours later, we were almost our destination. The road was terrible, filled with bumps and potholes. The car was shaking so much that it woke my friends up. They said they were hungry and, before long, we spotted a small diner by the side of the road. We decided to stop and have a snack. When we pulled up outside, we noticed that the diner much more dilapidated and run down than we had realized. Some of the letters were missing from the sign, and the windows were dirty and covered in insects. There was a guard dog on a chain sitting outside the front door. When we got closer, we realized it wasn't a dog at all, but a wild wolf. I pulled out my camera and took a picture of it. When we went inside, we saw that the diner was almost completely empty. The only other customer, besides us, was a creepy old woman. Her face was lined and wrinkled, and she looked like a homeless person. Her clothes were ragged and dirty. Flies were buzzing around her head, and every time she coughed, she hacked up a big wad of mucus and spit it out on the floor. The diner was filthy. The tables were stained with grease and the walls were crawling with bugs. All 3 of us were hungry, so we sat down and ordered some burgers, fries. While we waited, I couldn't take my eyes off the old woman. The most disturbing thing about her was that her right eye was missing. There was just an hollow, empty hole where her eye should have been. When she noticed we were looking at her, the woman became very irritated. She turned to face our table and began to laugh sarcastically. The waitress brought over our food and we started eating. The old lady saw we were still staring at her and she growled at us. Then, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a glass eye and held it up to her mouth. Her lips spread into a malevolent grin as she stuck out her tongue and began to lick it. It was the most disgusting thing I had ever seen. She was cackling like a hyena. Cyril grabbed my camera and said, "Hey old lady. Smile." Then he took a picture of her. The old woman suddenly stopped laughing and her face twisted into a scowl. She stood up and shuffled towards our table. We were surprised and a little frightened by this turn of events. She held up her glass eye and hurled it at us. It bounced all over the table, click, 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 as if it had a mind of its own. We watched in horror as the glass eye plopped into our drinks and rolled over our burgers and fries. She let out a string of obscene curses, calling us everything under the sun, then shuffled back to her table and sat down. We were left sitting there in stunned silence, shocked by her behavior. We couldn't eat the food after her eye had been all over it, so we just got up, threw some money on the table and left. As we walked out the door, the wolf who had been sitting quietly suddenly leaped up and started growling at us and gnashing its teeth. It was tugging against the chain and hopping back and forth, looking like it wanted to tear us apart. I looked up at the sky and saw that it was dark and there was a storm approaching. The wolf let out a long howl, and I remembered what my grandmother had always told me when I was a child: wolves always howl at those who are about to die. We quickly got back into our car and drove on. Within a few minutes, we had driven into the storm. Thunder and lightning started, and it began to rain heavily. I switched on the window wipers and tried to tune in a station on the radio. I wanted to put on some music to cheer us up and raise our spirits, but we were up in the mountains and the reception was poor. All I could find was a station playing old blues music. The clouds above grew darker and darker. I had to switch on the headlights. We drove in silence, listening to old blues guitarists singing creepy songs with lyrics like in the pines, where the sun don't ever shine, I would shiver the whole night through, and there's a hellhound on my trail. Looking over my shoulder, I saw my friends had fallen asleep in the back seat. When I turned around again to look at the road, I had to suddenly slam on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt on the wet road and Pasha and Cyril were thrown forward, hitting their heads on the front seats. "What are you doing?" they shouted angrily. "Look," I replied in a trembling voice. We couldn't believe our eyes. Standing in the road in front of us was the old lady from the diner. How could that crazy old bat get there so quickly? There was no way on earth. I got out of the car and cautiously approached the old woman. She just stared right through me. "I'm sorry," I said. "We apologize for what happened at the diner." Before I could finish, the old lady swung at me and slapped me across the face. The force of the blow was so strong that it knocked me off my feet. Pasha and Cyril jumped out of the car. Pasha lifted me up and dragged me back to the car while Cyril started shouting at the old woman. She just stood there and laughed in his face. Cyril ran towards her and probably would have hit her, but the old woman suddenly opened her mouth. From somewhere down in the depths of her body, there came a low buzzing sound. Then, a swarm of bees flew out of her mouth. They attacked Cyril, swarming all over his face, stinging his mouth, his nose, and his eyes. Cyril was screaming and trying to beat them off with his hands. We couldn't believe our eyes. Pasha stood next to me, not daring to move. Finally, Cyril collapsed on the ground and began writhing in pain. Large boils appeared on his face and his head swelled up like a ripe melon. The old woman threw her head back and began cackling loudly. Pasha and I jumped back into the car and locked all the doors from the inside. We were in a panic. My heart was pounding and I could barely breathe. I searched for the keys and Pasha began rooting around in his backpack, looking for his cell phone so he could call the police. When I looked up, the old lady was standing in front of the car, grinning at me. In her hand were the keys to the car and she laughed as she jingled them at me. Pasha and I stared at her, open-mouthed, as she walked around to the passenger window. With a balled fist, she banged against the glass and it shattered. She grabbed Pasha by the neck and began choking him. Then, she opened her mouth and let out a gust of nasty, fetid breath. I watched in horror and, right in front of my eyes, his face began to melt like ice in hot weather. I screamed. He put his hand to his face and when he pulled it away, the skin stuck to his hand and stretched like rubber. "My face," he cried. At that moment I lost all hope that we would get out of this mess alive. Pasha's face turned to liquid right in front of me. Blood and skin dripped off his skull like hot wax and his eyeballs dropped out of their sockets. He reached out for me with hands that were dripping with blood and mucus. In a hoarse, barely audible voice, he moaned, "Help me." I recoiled in horror and turned my head, unable to look at the disgusting sight. Then, the old woman reached out and touched my arm. I froze, unable to move. A searing pain shot through my whole body and my entire arm went black and withered away until it looked like the arm of a desiccated corpse. I kept screaming and screaming until I couldn't scream anymore and everything went black. We woke up the next morning, lying in a clearing in the woods. We were completely naked and our skin was covered from head to toe in terrible scratches. Our bodies ached as if we had been beaten and tortured all night. When we made our way back to the road, we found our car. The windows were all smashed and the exterior looked like it had been beaten with a hammer and scratched with a knife. The interior was charred and blackened as if it had been set on fire. Without a word, we crawled into the vehicle and drove down the road. The car chugged along as if it was going to give out at any moment. We eventually came to the diner and we crawled inside, begging for someone to help us and call the police. At a table in the corner, staring at us and laughing out loud, sat the old lady. Headless Annie is a spooky urban legend about the ghost of a young girl who was murdered in Harlan County, Kentucky. They say the ghost of a girl with no head haunts Big Black Mountain in Harlan County, Kentucky. The locals call her Headless Annie. Many years ago, Kentucky was coal mining country and Harlan County was where most of the mining camps were set up. There was a huge demand for coal and just about every able-bodied man in the area was hired to work in the coal mines. However, at that time, being a miner was a very dangerous job and the men started going on strike to force their bosses to increase their pay. The bosses responded by killing some of the miners on the picket lines and Harlan County became known as Bloody Harlan. According to the legend, around this time, there was a 12-year-old girl named Annie who lived on Big Black Mountain. Her father worked in the mines and he became very outspoken about wanting the workers to form a union. He became a thorn in the side of the mining companies and they wanted to make an example of him so that nobody else would dare to cross them. One night, the bosses sent a group of thugs out to Big Black Mountain. They dragged Annie and her father and mother out of bed and led them into the forest. First, they made Annie and her mother watch as they cut off her father's legs. Then, they hung his body on a meat hook that they tied high up in a tree, so he could bleed to death like a slaughtered pig. Annie was forced to watch as they murdered her mother in the same grisly fashion. Then, it was Annie's turn. The men chopped off her head and threw her body off a huge cliff that runs alongside the road. She lay there, undiscovered for days, while wild animals feasted on her carcass. Her murderers were never brought to justice. If you're on Big Black Mountain after dark, around the same time she died, they say you can see the ghost of Headless Annie wandering down the road. Some people claim to have seen her headless figure, dressed in a nightgown and surrounded by an unearthly glow. They say that when you pass by, she jumps onto the hood of your car and causes the engine to stall. Then, she checks to see if any of your windows are down. If she finds an open window, she will try to reach in and try to take your head. Night Ride. This story was told by an old doctor who lived a hermit's life in a small New England village. It happened when he was a young boy, but he told it and retold it in exactly the same way until his death. When the doctor was 15 years old, his father had a bay colt that he let his son ride. One evening the boy started riding to a nearby town. On the way he had to pass a cottage where a woman by the name of Dolly Spokesfield lived. She was rumored to have unusual powers, skill in the occult arts, and the ability to turn herself into almost anything she wished. She was, it was whispered, a genuine witch of the inner circle, certainly a person to be avoided by anyone out at night alone. As the lad approached the cottage that belonged to Dolly Spokesfield, he kept to the middle of the road and urged the colt to a faster trot. But his precautions were in vain. As the colt and rider came abreast of the cottage, a coal-black cat suddenly leaped out of the darkness and landed on the colt's neck. The frightened horse stopped short, almost throwing the boy over his head. The boy tried desperately to get rid of the cat and urged his mount on, beating him with his whip, but the cat held on and the colt refused to move with the vicious cat hissing upon his neck. The boy was afraid to leave his horse and run. In panic, he dismounted and began to beat the cat with the whip, holding the colt by the bridle rein as it reared and plunged, trying to shake off the terrifying creature. At last the boy dislodged the cat and hurriedly rode home. The poor colt was bruised and clawed, and apparently exhausted by his ordeal. So injured and frightened was he that the boy was afraid the animal would die before morning. He turned him loose in the barn instead of putting him in the stall, and went to bed trembling and fearful that the colt wouldn't last the night. At dawn, the boy hurried to the barn to inspect the battered and clawed animal. To his amazement, the young horse was in perfect condition. He showed no sign of exhaustion, and nowhere on his body could the boy find a trace of bruises from the whip, a claw mark, or a single reminder of the frantic events of the previous night. The story has an even stranger ending. A neighbor soon stopped by to report that Dolly Spokesfield had just been found almost dead, her body bruised and beaten as though by a whip. And under two of her fingernails were some short bay hairs, such as you'd find, perhaps, on the neck of a young colt ridden by a frightened boy alone in the night. Can you solve this mystery? In 1986, a man and his family had won tickets to Fiji in a contest. The family was packed and ready, and couldn't stop chatting about what they expected to see on their holiday. About halfway through the flight, the plane had a critical engine failure. The plane plummeted towards the ocean, and the last things the man heard were the terrified cries of his children. The man awoke on a desert island. It was late afternoon when he got up and looked around. He heard cries coming from behind him, and when he turned, he saw his wife and the pilot sitting around a campfire. He ran over to them. The wife explained how they crashed and all of the other passengers had died, including their children. The husband shed a tear. As they discussed what they were going to do, he noticed that his wife was missing a leg. It had been severed at the knee. He tried to tend to her injury, but the wound had become infected. She slipped into a coma and died in a matter of days. The husband and the pilot buried her body on the other side of the island. The pilot said a few words over the grave, and they returned to the campfire. They sat there, thinking about how they would survive. Finally, the husband fell asleep. For the next few days, they sat around the fire, waiting for help to arrive. They knew that if they weren't rescued soon, they would starve to death. One morning, the husband awoke and smelled something cooking. Looking around, he saw that the pilot was cooking something over the fire. He said he had managed to trap an albatross and was making albatross soup. They managed to survive by eating the albatross soup until they were rescued. Many years later, the husband was still grieving the death of his wife and family. He went to a restaurant and ordered albatross soup, just for old time's sake. As he put the first spoonful in his mouth, his eyes grew wide and the spoon fell from his hand. It tasted nothing like albatross soup. At that moment, he realized what had really happened on the island. The pilot who saw a dread future. Throughout history, there has been evidence that at times some people have caught glimpses of the future. Often these pictures of approaching events come in dreams. But they are also seen by people who are fully awake. Take the experience of George Potter, a Royal Air Force pilot during World War II. Wing Commander Potter was stationed at a base called RAF Shalufa in Egypt. From this base, bombing planes flew out over the Mediterranean Sea to plant torpedoes and mines in the paths of ships carrying supplies to the North African desert forces of the German General Erwin Rommel. This was a crucial period of the war, the first time the Allied armies were winning. They were pushing back the forces of the Germans' most successful general, known as the Desert Fox. The airmen's missions were extremely dangerous. Between bombing runs there was much nervous gaiety as they tried to forget the peril of their lives. They ate, drank, sang, and laughed as though they were schoolboys, which they had been not long before. One evening, Commander Potter entered the officers' mess with a friend, Flying Officer Reg Lamb. At a nearby table, a group of flyers were celebrating something, perhaps that they were still alive. One of them was a wing commander whom Potter refers to as Roy. After a few moments, Potter heard a loud burst of laughter from the table and glanced over that way. As he has described it, I turned and saw the head and shoulders of Roy moving ever so slowly in a background of blue blackness. His lips were drawn back from his teeth in a dreadful grin. He had no eyes in his eye sockets. The flesh of his face was blotched in greenish, purplish shadows. A few seconds later, Potter felt Reg Lamb tugging at his sleeve. "What's the matter?" Lamb asked. "You've gone white as a sheet. You look as if you've seen a ghost." "I have seen a ghost," Potter replied. Roy over there has the mark of death on him. Lamb looked over at the table of joking officers, but could see nothing unusual. That night Roy was shot down. He and his crew were seen clambering into a life raft, but the air sea rescue planes were unable to find them. The flyers were never heard from again. I then knew what I had seen, Potter relates. The blue-black background was the sea at night, and Roy was floating in it, dead, with his head and shoulders held up by his life jacket.